And good afternoon, everybody. Here's our final session of the day. And it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers, both very well known to everyone who has belonged to this society over the years. Michael Baur, who will speak first, is professor of philosophy and also professor of law, adjunct professor of law at Fordham University, where he's taught now for, goodness, about 20 years, I would think, getting on to that. Took his PhD at the University of Toronto, as we were discussing earlier in our meeting, and his doctorate in jurisprudence at Harvard University. Very pleased to have him joined by Dr. Wes DeMarco, who got his degree at Vanderbilt University, PhD, in 1991, and has taught as a senior lecturer at Clark since 2007. Senior lecturer promoted in 2014, and both have been longtime members of this society. And Michael, I think, has already, in addition, I'm sorry to say, gotten the, or served as the, am I trying to say, Secretary-Treasurer of the Catholic Philosophical Association. Is that right, Michael?
American Catholic Philosophical Association.
Catholic, yeah, ACPA, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask if Sienna will turn on the chat function for us. I think it is on now. And I'm going to ask that when both speakers are finished, anytime during this, you may enter your questions in the chat line. And I'd rather you use the chat line than the chat function rather than the raised hand function, simply because it's easier both to see and also to, grant you your place in line according to the entry of your chats. So with that, let's begin. And Michael, will begin with you.
Great, thank you. Can I be heard okay? Yep.
Sounds so to me, yes.
Okay, good. So let me start by thanking Larry Cahoon for organizing this and for those who have been helping him at Holy Cross, as well as George. Let me thank you for, number one, commenting, and secondly, for putting up with my lateness and getting the paper to you. You've been very patient and understanding. And also, finally, let me thank everybody for being here. I hope to make it worth your while. Let me also begin with two apologies. I'm going to have trouble with both time and space. I'm going to try and get through everything I think I need to get through within a limited time. My trouble with space is that I'm going to be probably reading and looking down and going off of the Zoom camera. So I apologize if I'm not easy to follow because I'll be moving around. But let me just jump right into it and move quickly through what I have to say. I may have to edit as we go along. What I try to do in this presentation is rely on insights from emergentism, Peircean pragmaticism, Wittgensteinian naturalism, and Aristotelian metaphysics in order to make the case that there's teleology in the natural world and that being and goodness are convertible, that being and order are convertible. To say that something is good, according to Aristotle, is to say that it is desirable or aimed at. If every being desires or aims at its own existence, and if every being by virtue of existing has achieved that which it aims at, then wherever we have some intellectual apprehension of what is, we also have an intellectual apprehension of some instance of achievement or success or goodness. So the implication is that teleology is operative in all natural beings, not just in living beings. Now, in order to advance the view I want to present here, I'm going to unpack the meaning and implications of four interrelated claims. I won't be able to make good on proofs for all these claims, but let me at least make a start. One, there are no universals or generals, no intelligible forms if there are no habits in things. If things do not make a difference to other things in regularized, stabilized ways, there are no universals or generals in things. If things did not have habits, then they would not be the identifiable, relatively stable, repeatedly acting kinds of things that they are. Two, final causality is the cause of formal causality, and not the other way around. Final causality is explanatorily prior to formal causality. Along these lines, Peirce makes the case that every desire is general and desires create classes. 3, Aristotle's argument in the Physics, Book 2, Chapter 8, I want to hold, which is an argument in favor of natural teleology, is not meant to rebut a materialist thesis, which holds that any individual occurrence results of necessity from existing material elements. Rather, Aristotle's argument is meant to rebut an eliminativist thesis, which holds that explanation by means of material causality renders altogether unnecessary teleological claims about multiply stabilized natural occurrences. 4, explanation by means of formal causality is made possible only because there's operative in nature a kind of final causality, which makes those actualities, which are knowable through formal causality, into the stable, intelligible, regularized, knowable actualities that they are. So an account of final causality is an account of why it is that stabilized things are the stabilized, intelligible things that they are in the first place. Okay. In book 12 of his Metaphysics, Aristotle makes use of an army analogy. So we do have some military background. There's going to be some military content to this paper, actually. There's an army analogy that Aristotle uses in order to argue that there are two ways in which we can talk about the ordering of parts within a whole. There is the ordering of the parts to one another, which amounts to the intrinsic good of the whole, and there's the ordering of the whole to some external good. Now, in Aristotle's account, a whole as such is capable of performing actions that cannot be the actions of any part. When we speak about actions of the whole, which are not actions of any part of the whole, we are speaking, I suggest, about what has come to be known as emergent properties, properties which belong to a whole, which has emerged from the togetherness of many parts, but which belong to no part from which the whole has emerged. So let me just make a couple of terminological observations. When I talk about parts and wholes, I'm talking about terms that are used relatively. What is a whole in one respect can be a part of a larger whole. In another respect, what is a whole in one respect can be a part of a larger whole. What is a larger whole can be a part of still larger wholes, all the way down. Number 2, the wholeness of the whole requires not just the aggregation of parts, but rather an order or ordering among parts. Some have argued that such an order or ordering requires some kind of reciprocal causality among or between the parts. For now, I simply want to make the observation that an aggregation is not enough to explain the ordering, or the pattern, or the arrangement, or the wholeness of the parts. After all, one can observe a form or pattern within a set of parts, even when there's non-regularized divergences from the wholeness or the pattern. There goes my phone. And so an arrangement or ordering is compatible with non-regular divergences from the pattern or the arrangement, which means aggregation alone, togetherness alone in space and time doesn't account for the wholeness of the whole. Thirdly, I want to argue that not only is it the case that being and goodness are convertible with one another, but that being and order are convertible with one another. If there's no ordering of parts that makes the whole hang together, there is no being. So there's no being in the first place I want to hold unless there's an order and ordering of parts within the being such that the ordering allows the being to hold itself together and persist as a non-simple being in the first place. Now, in affirming the convertibility of being and goodness and of being and order, and in denying that there can be any natural being which is utterly simple or partless, I take myself to be affirming, though I can't fully justify this, that there's no such thing as ostensive definition. There's no such thing as a bare particular. Another way to come at the same basic point would be to say that there are no universals or no generals in us if there are no habits in things. There's no universals or intelligible forms known by us if there are no habits in things. So in order for anything to be cognizable or noticed by us, it must show itself to us in more than a fleeting set of moments. It must be able to register for us under some description as a universal of some kind. The thing, in order to be apprehended, must have been encountered by us across a multiplicity of moments. Peirce makes a similar point when he says that any endurance through time already involves generality. Now, this way of understanding how generals, forms, habits, tendencies are interrelated ends up calling into question what is a common but I think mistaken understanding of the relation between formal and final causality. It's commonly thought that things exist because they have the formal causes that they have, and that secondarily, because they have this formal causality, they also happen to act in certain ways that bring about certain ends. I want to suggest that this is backwards. What is explanatorily prior is not that things have formal causes that make them instances of kinds. What is prior in explanation is that things have the tendency or habit of bringing about certain determinate ends. And it is because of this teleological tendency that they are correctly said to be instances of kinds in the first place. In other words, it's final causality which accounts for formal causality, not the other way around. Sorry about the phone. It didn't ring all day today. The account I'm trying to present here then has the following implication. Just as it's a mistake to think of knowing and defining in terms of individuals alone, so too it's a mistake to think of formal causality in terms of individuals alone. And so too, it's a mistake to think of final causality in terms of individuals alone. What I'm putting forward here sounds very Peircean, and it is, but I want to hold that it's equally Aristotelian in its own way. It's possible to begin seeing a real convergence between Peirce and Aristotle on this very point. If one looks at Book 2, Chapter 19 of Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, where he gives the example of the rout in battle, you see how one individual conglomerates with another, and before long you have a stabilized whole. I'll leave that argument just on the table. We can discuss it perhaps in greater detail later, but I think the argument can be made. Now, it might seem that the main thesis I'm putting forward here is something like this. In order to know the formal cause of a thing, we have to know the final cause of a thing. But that is not exactly my thesis. The thesis rather is this. The existence or operativeness of a formal cause within anything is made possible only by the operation of a final cause, which made the actuality corresponding to the formal cause into the relatively stable, knowable actuality that it is in the first place. There are plenty of stabilities that can be known as the stabilities that they are, even if one does not know just why they are the stabilities that they are. Once one can give an account of why they are the stabilities that they are, one will be then appealing to habits, tendencies, orientations towards an end. And so final causality is prior in explanation to formal causality, even if in the first instance, the final causality that makes the formal causality what it is not immediately and directly available to us. Final causality, in other words, is operative already in the present, but its operation is not in the first instance directly knowable by us. In the first instance, final causality operates through one might think of as a chaotic set of stirrings and startings and fluctuations, which can then become tendencies and habits and then generate stabilities, which then become knowable. So stability and form emerge out of and are explained by tendency and finality. And again, it's clear that I'm bringing Peirce and Aristotle in a certain way into conversation here. Now, so that encapsulates an overview of the point I want to make. And I want to make now secondarily a broader point about how it is that I think a certain metaphysics of presence, a metaphysics that's fixated on the whatness of things and not on why there are things to begin with. So a metaphysics of presence, I want to suggest, often blocks our way of understanding final causality correctly. And in order to make the case, I want to draw on an illustration, a military illustration regarding what is called the bullet hole paradox, which helps us illuminate what is called survivorship bias. And I think this helps us to understand better how to think about teleology in nature. During World War II, the US military examined damage done that was done to returning planes as they came back from combat. Many of the planes that were examined upon return showed large amounts of damage in some areas. The US military drew the obvious and compelling conclusion that the airplane's wings and tail areas, which were the most damaged parts of the airplanes as they returned, ought to be better armored because those were the areas which sustained the most damage. This obvious and compelling conclusion was flatly contradicted by the advice of Abraham Wald, W-A-L-D, who was at Columbia University doing statistical work in order to help sustain the war effort. According to Wald, the areas of the airplanes which really should be given additional armor were precisely those which, on the returning planes, had shown the least amount of damage. Why? Because the airplanes which could be examined for bullet holes were those airplanes which had survived in the first place. And the very fact of their survival showed that airplanes of their particular make and model were capable of flying safely, even with the damage that was done to them. The airplanes which did not survive to return could not be examined, of course, but their very non-survival allowed Wald to draw correct inferences about how airplanes should be reinforced for future sorties. By relating his knowledge of the non-survival of some airplanes to his knowledge about the damage done to the surviving airplanes, he was able to draw the correct, statistically sound conclusion that the additional armor should be added precisely to those areas which, on the returning planes, showed the least amount of damage. Now, I think there are two important philosophical lessons that we might take from the notion of the bullet hole paradox and the idea of survivorship bias. In other words, we make judgments based on what survives, but not the fact that it did survive. First, we can see that Wald was able to draw inferences about what was defective or missing in the failed non-surviving entities only indirectly, only by relying on what he knew about the surviving entities or what he knew before any planes went out because they were manufactured. And this is the important point. He knew in advance that the parts on the non-surviving planes were similar to those on the surviving planes, and it was the absence of the non-existence of certain parts on the non-surviving planes that explained their absence or non-existence as planes as a whole. When one part is damaged, the whole plane doesn't return. And so corresponding to parts where something was not missing on the returning planes, he inferred that there must be parts where something was missing on the non-returning planes. Since the returning and non-returning planes were both artifacts made by humans and thus could be known to have the same shared structure, it was possible for him to conclude that the presence or the being of an intact outer surface on parts of the returning surviving planes corresponded to the absence or non-being of an intact outer surface on parts of the non-returning planes. He was able to make this inference because he had prior and independent knowledge that the returning and the non-returning planes shared the same humanly designed structure. Now, it's clear that entities in the natural world similarly end up surviving or failing to survive in their own way, in ways that are similar to the ways in which the planes that Wald observed either survived or didn't survive. And this is the second crucial philosophical lesson. Our knowledge of surviving and failed entities in the natural world is different in a crucial way from the knowledge that Wald had regarding the returning and non-returning planes during the war. Unlike in the case of Wald, we do not always have the ability to rely on prior and independent information about natural entities as such, which would allow us to know that surviving and non-surviving instances of those entities share any common design or structure. What we're able to come to know about what is present or absent, or what is missing or not missing in natural entities, is known, strictly speaking, only from the surviving entities. And so when we can come to know that some feature of a natural entity is defective in some way or missing, the defect or missingness can never be of the kind that causes the very non-survival of the entire natural entity itself. That is, the defect or the missingness in the natural thing can never be like the defect or the missingness that Wald correctly judged to exist on the outer surface of those non-returning airplanes. For in the case of natural entities, if some defect or missingness is the cause of the failure of the whole entity itself, then it would be impossible for us to know such a defect precisely as a defect. For precisely insofar as a defect leads to the failure of the whole natural entity itself, the defect also brings about the non-knowability of itself as a defect. For that which is said to be non-existent is not knowable as such. Okay, I hope I'm being clear. I just wanted to draw a couple conclusions because I think I maybe have a minute or two, if I'm not mistaken. Right. So the failed instances, precisely insofar as they're failed instances, end up counting as nothing for us. Their non-survival is not knowable to us as such, precisely because of that very non-survival. And in the case of these failed instances, the natural entities, they didn't last long enough. They didn't hang together robustly enough to be the surviving, stable, successful, knowable instances that they turn out to be. Just think about all of those rabies-like viruses that didn't make it because their properties didn't cause their hosts to be aggressive and bite other animals and then spread themselves. Think about all those coronaviruses that didn't make it because they didn't have the kind of spikes that attached correctly to mammalian respiratory systems. They were there, but they're not knowable to us in any direct way. So the twofold conclusion I want to draw is this: we can speak about failed non-surviving natural entities, which are not knowable to us as such, precisely because they are failed instances and have not persisted in being. We can speak about them. And secondly, we can say that all natural entities which are knowable to us as such are knowable precisely because they have persisted in being, and thus precisely because they are instances of survival, success, achievement. In other words, all beings that can be present and observed and known by us as such are the equivalent of the Waldian airplanes that did return, and their presence or knowability to us counts as evidence of their having been successful, having succeeded. It accounts as evidence not because there's something specific that we know about such beings in contradistinction to some other thing that we know about other things that are also present. Rather, it counts as evidence precisely because such beings are present and knowable in contradistinction to those things that didn't make it and are not present to us. And the things that did persist and make themselves present to us and become knowable to us, they did not have to be. The very fact that they are is rooted in the fact that they were a success. They did not have to be, but they did. Why? Because their being was achieved. 3 very quick lessons. I think there's a metaphysics of presence that affected Wald's contemporaries and led them to think wrongly about the returning and non-returning planes. I think there's a metaphysics of presence where we focus on what's present rather than on what could have been but wasn't. Number 2, I think that this is potentially an argument in favor of teleology, not only in living things, but in anything that is stable enough to survive. And number 3, because there are habits in us only where there's habits in things, I think it's possible to link naturalism with a later Wittgensteinian account of language, because language is, after all, nothing other than a system of interactions that enables us to cope in ways that survive. Those words, those grunts, those sounds that don't help us cope, they don't survive either. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. We'll turn now to the second paper in our session, which is on naturalizing nature. Wes?
Thanks so much, Michael. I enjoyed your paper so much. I want to jump in with questions, but I'll bite my lip and first begin by also thanking Larry Cahoon for putting this together. It's been frustrating for him, and I know he's been long suffering. And I particularly want to thank George for his shorter but more intense suffering. I got him the full version of this paper, which is like 32,000 words or something, like a couple of days ago, and only half-baked chunks before that. So many thanks to you, George. So this project is an attempt to rethink nature in relation to the sciences, focusing on presuppositions of the sciences that the sciences cannot themselves comprehend on pain of contradiction. That's the claim, at least. This will leave us, I argue, with a concept of nature that's richer than scientific naturalism or strict naturalism, as De Caro defined it in our first session, and more philosophically adequate than liberal naturalism of the sort that he endorses. The keystone, of course, is, not surprisingly for this group, a certain kind of metaphysics, which I will sketch can do no more than that, given that it's a long paper. In this paper, there's some new stuff, some old stuff for my long-standing friends in the MSA. I'm trying in this paper to be more explicit about argument than I have before. There's more structure. I think it's improved. I'm trying anyway. And the good thing about this is that it highlights those points of transition where you might want to go, no, not that. That will make hopefully your job a little easier. But it's precisely those points that I invite you to linger, perhaps, and consider the alternatives to the position as well as the position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a share screen because I have a summary outline. I'm working with very little space here, so forgive me. I have a summary outline that's in the downloadable paper, but let me go to that now. Basically there are 11 sections to the paper. I always like to dial things up to 11, 10 parts and a conclusion. And each of those in the paper, I have a summary, bold statement, a brief explication, then more explication in a smaller font, and then a bunch of stuff in the notes. So there are 4 levels of detail as you go through the paper. So if anybody's inclined to check it out, you can read it in those layers. That's, I hope, I've never done it that way before. Maybe it worked, maybe it doesn't, but that's the way it's worked out. So what I've done is I've extracted those 10 major points. And I'm now going to go to oh, it's not it. Where is it? There it is. Here are the 10 points. And I know the print's tiny, so let me bring it in a little bit. Part 1 is what I call a Gödelian palate cleanser. I claim that mainstream versions of naturalism, hard or soft, must fail. This failure makes room for metaphysics of the intelligibility conditions of the sciences. I don't for a minute believe that that's the only thing metaphysics does or can do, but that's my focus here in the paper. My claim is that this is enough, ought to be enough to really expand our sense of nature and give us something to think further about and bring back to our reflections on the tradition. This is an ad positionem argument, meaning that it targets a certain collection of conceptions of science. This argument does not work against, nor is it intended to work against, classical episteme views, views like Cartwright's that present science as a motley, or Dupre's disunity of science. It's intended to focus those positions which say science gives us all the truths. And the reason why we should at least begin to think that there's something suspect in that, many of us have those doubts anyway, is the following Gödelian sentence: the truth of this statement cannot be established scientifically. It's one of those simple gambits, not strict Gödel. It's not a Gödel sentence, it's a Gödelian sentence. And if the statement is true, well, then there's something science can't establish. If the statement is false, perhaps science has established it, but it's in contradiction with that statement. Falsifications of the sentence similarly fall into this. And if we take an analysis of the Gödel result, which takes soundness and completeness, and rather than necessary and sufficient conditions, and we say Gödel's own result shows that you can't have an axiom system in say a Principia type of logic that includes mathematics. It can't be both sound and complete. Here I'm taking that more broadly as all statements and only statements. So we translate that into something like a collection of sciences, or a collection of inquiries, or perhaps a single inquiry that accounts for all the truths about nature, or that accounts for only truths about nature. And my claim is in the first part of the paper that this little sentence, this Gödelian sentence, should make us suspect that it's impossible, on pain of contradiction, to have a study that gives us all and only the truths about nature. We ought to take up as a consequence a kind of division of labor among the inquiries, such that there are disciplines that study only nature, but not all of nature, and those which study all of nature, but not only nature. And of course, my suggestion is, well, the sciences are the former, and philosophy, including metaphysics, is the latter. that we're thinking about all of nature, but perhaps not only nature. So with that kickoff, I call it a palate cleanser to clear the way, because it doesn't imply anything about the particular kind of account that ought to be given, but it opens the door to, of course, what I'm going to provide in the constructive sections of the paper. And I begin then in the second section. Here we go. Experience and inference afford an introductory concept of nature with these two sets of qualities. First, it's processive. We observe change and becoming. And nature is somehow, we see generation all around us. This is part of the etymology. I could add etymology to inference and experience. Nature is natality, nature, to use a term borrowed from Hannah Arendt. It's generative, productive. Second, nature, as we encounter it in this intuitive and preliminary way, entails reflexivity into related senses. Those are first, that nature seems to have its own kind of integrities and natures in the plural, apart from human interests and what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of interventions, and also that even within natural orders, that certain things seem to stand on their own. They seem to have their own kinds of self-references that don't reduce to the fabric of causality. It's as the scholastics used to put it, the extra causam stare. This is just a vague introduction. It's then supposedly cleaned up by section 3, the introductory concept of nature as natality. I suggest, well, intuitive, I claim it's intuitive, is vague and preliminary. To advance further, it's useful and good to consider classical oppositions. Now, I give 7 of these oppositions, and it's the work of the paper to set those out and actually address each one, which I try to do at least briefly in some section of the paper. Those are nature and convention, nature and appearance, nature and change, nature and norm, nature and mind, nature and culture, nature and freedom. And there are 2 features. There's a lot of contrast there. But my claim is that there are 2 features that I want to highlight in the paper. First, that the bright line, which seems to be a bright line at first, the line that divides nature from its contrast, typically falls, at least in the first instance, on a line between the human and the non-human. So it's human appearance, human culture, human norms, which are contrasted with nature. The second point is that each one of these 7 contrasts, all up and down the line, are reversible in that we might take nature to be contrasted with appearance, or we might take nature to be a system of appearances. Put nature on the other side. We might take nature to be contrasted with convention, or we might admit that the concept of nature is itself a convention with its own history, its own social construction, and what have you. So that reversibility, which looks to make the concept of nature particularly problematic, I claim is in fact an important hint about how we ought to proceed philosophically. And this next section then, and I haven't used this language before, and I'm trying it out. I'm not entirely convinced it's the way to go, but I draw on a reconstructed version of the distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata, naturing nature and natured nature. And I say that this distinction can anticipate the general form of the kind of solution I want to give, which is a single solution to address all 7 of those contrasts, particularly in their reversibility. And this has to be a reconstructed contrast very quickly for a couple of reasons. I give a list in the paper. Traditionally, back to medieval times, and certainly in the Quattrocento uses of this distinction, it mainly indicated an active-passive distinction, even prior to its theological use. So naturing nature is active, natured nature is passive. That's problematic. And one way of remedying this is to introduce a third element and make it a triad, so that there are natured naturings. A simple thing, but that I think that helps, because nature as we observe it, they're natured naturings. Also, I don't have any theological program. I suspend judgment on those things, at least for the purpose of this project. And there are some other refinements, but the basic idea is that if you take each one of these 7 contrasts, and remember, nature can appear on either side of those contrasts. Well, the reason why nature can appear on either side of those contrasts is because a natured naturing, in fact, does appear on both sides of those contrasts, human and non-human. So there's a kind of natural process occurring in both cases, but they may be very different. They may be contrasting. And yet in those differences, sometimes despite those differences, there's a shared ontological ancestry, a common root in naturing nature more primitively. That's the basic structure of the approach I want to take. And then in the central sections of the paper, I give more details by plugging in a metaphysics of qualifications, which I've talked about before the society, and which I've developed in a number of places. So that refinement then is spelled out in the next 3 sections, which are really the guts of the paper. And I'll just read my little summary here. 5th step. Now here's where I'm returning to the place where I began, which is that I'm looking at certain presuppositions of the sciences, and I'm looking at 3. Pardon me, I'm looking at logic, mathematics, and meaning, which is a catch-all phrase for that general study of meaning, that general study of symbol. It's semiotic, it's hermeneutics. I tend to regard my work as, sort of extending, augmenting a Persian tradition, but it's that zone. When I talk about meaning, it's that rather than the kind of approach which is typical in the mainstream, the analytic mainstream, where we devise a theory of meaning from a theory of truth understood in a certain kind of way, typically truth conditional. We get that first. We think, the mainstream thinks they have those ducks in a row, and so therefore they can build a theory of meaning on that, rather than the kind of approach that one finds typically in continental thought, where you develop an account of meaning first, historically through subjectivity or intersubjectivity, and then develop an idea of truth as disclosure out of that. I'm claiming there's something more basic. So anyway, so those are the 3 sets of presuppositions that I'm looking at: logic, math, and meaning. And my claim is that each of these is best understood, best at least in relation to the purpose I'm pursuing, through its most elementary generative operations. I've made this pitch for the society before, but the basic idea is, think of Peirce, who first discovered the stroke function. You can use that single function to articulate all of logic first and higher order through repeated applications of itself to its own results. Single operation. I think something similar can be found in mathematics, at least when it comes to numbers. And my argument is that there's something similar for semiosis or general theory of symbol as well. I review each of those little tidbits of argument in the paper with references to other places where I elaborate. And if you all want to ask me about that, that's fine. But that's step 5. And that leaves us with a sense that there's something already which, if you do psychology and you're doing cognitive, let's say you're a cognitivist psychologist, and you're analyzing logic as some of them, you're looking at mathematics, for example, the way Lakoff and Nunez do. There are very interesting things to show, but you're not going to find a dedicated module for stroke functions or Dedekind cuts or Conway cuts or that kind of thing. Those are the result of formal inquiries, which have their own purpose and their own standing. And it seems to me that it's important that we not confuse those things. And the same is true for general account of meaning or semiosis. So step 6, I claim now that there are, and this is the steps 6 and 7 really are the most important, I think, or the most pivotal, let's say. 6 in step 6, I claim there are conditions common to all domains of natural process, common in that they show up everywhere, but also in that the qualifications of each domain relate directly to what I call general forms of qualification as their own primitive principles. Now, the first thing you want to ask is, well, common to what? Common meaning what? Well, internal to the argument of the paper, the main thing is common to the sides of those contrasts. So nature as appearance, nature is contrasted with appearance, nature is convention, nature as opposed to convention, and so forth down the line. Common to all those, we ought to ask, it's an important question to ask, what if anything is common to those various senses of nature. We also could approach this by looking at what's sometimes called the metaphysics of experience. Let's look at experience most broadly, or we could look at practice most broadly, particularly if we include the sciences as practices. There are various ways of approaching this, but this idea of common conditions is pivotal to the project. Rather than a foundationalist sort of model where we say, okay, let's go straight to physics, or the other way, straight to mind. I claim later on that we'll get misleading theories and metaphysics that will be partial or problematic if we do that. Rather, let's look at the commonalities, and then, this is step 7, look to the principles precisely of those commonalities. And let me then, so step 6 is the foxier part of the theory. Step 7 is the hedgehoggier part of the theory, if I could put it that way. We have to take the full breadth of experience, the sciences, the humanities, the arts, the full range, and then look for their common principles. What we get, and here this is the end of section 6 here, we get this general form of signification, which is my approach to semiotics, basically. I just call it general form of symbol or significant. I prefer to use the language of signification. Semiotics, despite its lovely history, is kind of a mortgaged language, I think. I've tried to shy away from that in recent years, but it's a similar project. And the idea there is, and you can see the details in the paper, if you haven't heard them before in the society, that any sign has a form which is due to a sequence of formative operations. It's basically as of, through, with, and in operations. They can be summarized in prepositions, but they give us formative acts, which I call the elementary acts of nature, are adapted by us in our symbol making and symbol using activities. And these are, I'm looking at time, I can mention these quickly, at least 5 basic types. There's N-action, E-N, N-action, which consists of activities of bounding, bordering, via establishing relative internalities and externalities, gathering and scattering, and so forth. Determine the relative openness and closedness of systems. Second would be faction or natural partitivity, natural aspection. This is the idea that there's a generative source of the always conditional and always partial interactions in nature via acts of sampling and parsing and rationing and filtering and so forth that we see up and down or let's say throughout the domains of nature. Proaction, there's final causality. I'm an unrepentant teleologist, but I think we need to be very careful about how it's set out. I was struck in Michael's paper, the way you talk about chaotic beginnings, and I tend to look at this as a general attractor theory. These are attractors throughout nature in different senses in different domains. The forms that the operative forms that go to make coaction that establish these attractor states establish beginning, middle, end differences, means and end differences, means extremes differences. Those are structures that are actively induced by those elementary acts of nature, which fall under the rubric of proaction. There's coaction, which is fields, environments, context through nesting, embedding, and so forth. And transaction is the fifth, which has to do with givings and takings, inflows and outflows, and so forth. Anyway, I've talked about that before the society and already probably took too long sketching that, but I rehearsed that in the paper and connect that with general theory of significance, this sign equals IAPTC, this little string of operations. So I need to get to section 7 now, and then I'll wrap up. Section 7, I say commonality in this sense implies ontological priority. Why? Because the priority explains the commonality. That's the move. Given the commonality, we need an explanation. See? So what explains the commonality is something that's prior. So I don't want to say that's sign function per se. I don't want to say that's, logic and math per se. I want to say there are metaphysical conditions for each of these. And I call this the language doesn't matter, the C2P, commonality to principle argument, or breadth to depth argument. And this is the move to metaphysics, because the idea is that the commonality implies the priority. More specifically, if logical structures are prior to the physical, logically and ontologically, I argued that above in the paper. If the forms of qualification, those are the conditions that show up in the commonality section. If the forms of qualification are prior to the logical, then the forms of qualification are ontologically prior to the physical. Therefore, there's a sense in which metaphysics is prior to physics. A limited sense, but an important sense. And it's in the conditions of the commonalities. There's a sort of, I call it a detour, but it's really not. Section 8 rehearses some work I've done on the nature of contingency, the modality that's required for this. I think a non-standard account of modality is required for this, different forms of possibility, necessity, and what have you. I'm not going to talk about that at all here. It's actually quite important, because if you understand nature's dynamic, it's really important to see the generativity and what kind of accounts required to deeply understand this. It's in this section that I introduce the language of axiogenesis, aitiogenesis, propriogenesis. That is to say, refining the understanding of nature as natality. Natality is the generation of natures in the plural, and natures are generated through new properties, new kinds of entities, new kinds of final causes, new kinds of individuals as well. And then finally, and I'll stop here because I think I've got 2 minutes. When nature's understood as dynamic qualification, changes nature's dynamic, and the dynamism needs us to go to the very basic level. So I've tried to infer to these metaphysical principles, these forms of qualification from the commonalities. The dynamism must rest there. Otherwise, nature's not thoroughly, otherwise you won't find the aitiogenesis, the axiogenesis, and so forth. So when nature is understood as dynamic qualification, what are often called emergent levels, should be framed as matrices of qualification. I call them, in a cutesy way, I call those Q-mats, M-A-T, Q-mat. Matrices of qualification. And the transitions should be regarded as qualification shifts. Now, this should is conditional. They should be so conceived if your interest is in the commonalities and the principles of the commonalities and the being of nature. So if your interest is in the being of nature, where nature's thoroughly dynamic, down into its most primitive forms of qualification, then I say this view should recommend itself to you. I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much for your attention. And I see the inaudible applause. Great. And I will now stop the share screen and take it away, George.
Wes and Michael, you guys are way too smart for me. I'm probably just going to mess this up, but at least I'll try and do it quickly so we can get on to more intelligent questions from the rest of our participants this afternoon. Your session on generating complexity invites a close comparison between the work we've heard from both of you today, this afternoon, and this morning's presidential address by Larry Cahoon. as well as our opening keynote by Mario De Caro. But in this case, this afternoon, both of you chose to focus more specifically on the longstanding problem of teleology and metaphysics, focusing in particular on what I like to call the problem of complexification, or what used to variously be called the upward thrust of evolution and the emergence of time of ever greater complexity. As a sidebar, in the 19th, early 20th century, such emergence was considered the antithesis of entropy, and therefore a puzzle that required invocation of some sort of deus ex machina. Spirit for Hegel, for example, but famously not in nature itself, unless you give consideration in his Science of Logic to forms of explanation, not just mechanism, but chemism and teleology. Tychism and cynicism in Peirce, or agapism, evolutionary love. The élan vital for Bergson, Morgan, Teilhard, Alexander, and other emergent evolutionists. Only toward the end of the 20th century did we learn, statistically speaking, that ever greater self-organization is compatible with, rather than at odds with, the second law of thermodynamics. An organization or organized system is always the lowest possible entropy state for a system far from its equilibrium point. Peirce, perhaps, along with Whitehead, was the most perceptive in anticipating this kind of finding, that there's no need to invoke mystery in nature in order to account for life, mind, consciousness, other levels of emergent behavior or supervenient properties in the natural world. Now, in the first paper, Michael offers a position thoroughly grounded in Aristotle's metaphysics, that teleology and final causation are an irreducible part of nature itself, as Aristotle held. But interestingly, without purpose, even in non-living things, Michael argues there can be no being. Aristotle observed that in order to be intelligible, a thing must exist in the fullness of being, which means in turn, or at least implies, that everything aims toward the actualization of some good, its entelechy, or that is a pattern, a purposive pattern, intrinsic to itself. In that sense, he argues, being and goodness are metaphysically linked, if not identical. And every such impulse of a thing towards actualizing its full potential is perforce a movement toward greater complexity. Things that are not successful in operationalizing their intrinsic good are not simply failures. They are literally no thing, if I've got that right, nothing at all. As Michael remarks, quote, all natural entities which are knowable to us as such are knowable precisely because they have persisted in being, and thus precisely because they are instances of survival, success, and achievement. Now, that comment that I just quoted follows Baur's account of Abraham Wald and the so-called bullet hole paradox. That's really fascinating. And let me just retrace a couple of steps for a reason I'll explain at the very end. The paradox is that examining extensive damage suffered by aircraft returning from combat led the military experts on one hand, my bosses, to conclude that in preparation for future sorties, the surviving aircraft should be strengthened and reinforced in the most highly damaged areas. Wald recognized, by contrast, that that was a kind of blockheaded thinking, and that engineers should strengthen the areas that must have failed on the non-surviving, non-returning aircraft. But how could one examine something that was itself absent, non-surviving, therefore unexaminable or unknowable? Well, only by recognizing the extensive damage done to wings and tail of the surviving aircraft proved nonetheless to be sustainable, so that the ones that did not survive and return must have suffered damage elsewhere that wasn't sustainable. A clever piece of statistical inference, that, and possible, as Michael points out, only because all aircraft in question shared the same formal structure that allowed that deduction or inference. Where we do not know anything about a shared formal structure between known and successful forms of being, and others which are presumably unsuccessful and therefore unknown, we cannot infer anything concerning failure, defects, or limitations in those forms of being. Rather, we can conclude nothing at all, because such hypothetical beings have no actualized being. In that sense, being, as contrasted with non-being, entails success in attaining its own intrinsic form, the good. I think at that point in Michael's argument, we need to close, or need to finish, close the circle or close the open loop in an argument. I think the point to be noticed is that inasmuch as a range of complexity is a feature of all forms of being, think elaborate atomic and subatomic structures, for example, or crystals, or malevolent viruses, all the way to consciousness, human mind, galaxies, and so forth. We must therefore, following Wald's inference, conclude that such features are elements of intrinsic goodness and being. There is no being simpliciter, absent complex features, rather only non-being. Larry Cahoon mentioned this morning in his own conclusion, natural complexes cannot be symbols. And so here I think we can conclude with Michael that complexity and increasing complexification of being is therefore an intrinsic property of existence, rather than a mystery that requires explanation. Anyway, let me propose that as topic for conversation and discussion, and then turn to Wes's paper. And in his case, he's already mentioned what Mario Di Caro yesterday described as liberal pluralistic naturalism, as opposed to restrictive naturalism. And Wes is invoking a similar, but in interesting ways, distinctive conception here in using Spinozistic terminology, the natura naturans, the self-activating nature, and natura naturata, the restrictive and causal constrained approach that form the 7 contrasts he described. This is the ans ata contrast, as he puts it in the longer version of the paper. While nature as a whole is inherently processive and radically generative, his words, Wes nonetheless has a somewhat more tendentious approach, I think, to the resulting layers of emergence of a self-activating nature than Larry's open, gracious, inclusive description of those layers of complexities in his cosmic egg this morning. Here, by contrast, in Wes's case, some people are going to lose out. They're going to be offended. And some things like physics, math, and logic will be limited in their applicability, possibly even excluded from some levels, because they're not common to all levels. Nature at large can be characterized, Wes claims, as, quote, a sequence of formed transformers or contingency harnessing contingencies of different kinds. In physics-based accounts, the sequence would be styled as a stack of emergent levels, but these levels in Wes's account are framed as what he terms qualification shifts that induce larger scale deviations in nature's contingency branchings. These shifts, he writes, mark changes in the basic sorts of natural processes that define different classes of phenomena and hence different fields of inquiry. So if I haven't screwed your paper entirely up in this brief summary, it looks like that unlike Larry, DeMarco does seem to advocate an ontological priority among some of these levels, even while resisting the urge to top-down or bottom-up reductionism within them. Metaphysical inquiry, rather than physics or neurophysiology for that matter, seems to be the ultimate beneficiary of all this, owing to its commonality in all of these layers. Now, if I've got that right, then I'd conclude by saying, yay for us, and also Hawking and Weinberg and others, go suck eggs. Anyway, there we are. And ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open. I hope you have begun typing in some questions or
I think May has a question for
May
Michael.
has a question, yes,
Yeah.
for Michael. Go ahead, May.
Yes, thanks so much, Michael. That was a great paper. I very much enjoyed it. But I'm just wondering if you might be prioritizing final causality over formal causality in a way that unnecessarily separates the two, when in fact they actually coincide. So that if just to consider Aristotle's account, if you have something that is formed or shaped in a certain way, then it also means that it is already actively engaging in the activity or the habits that you're talking about, so that it is engaging in the being and the goodness and the ordering of the thing. And so I'm just puzzled by why you are separating the two and then prioritizing the final over the formal. That seems to be very artificial.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that great question. And I think at the end of the day, I want to affirm the coincidence of final and formal causality in things, which I think is what you pointed to. Having a form, organization, a pattern, arrangement really is a way of succeeding. And so you can talk about formal and final cause as being coincident in any instance of being. What I'm suggesting, it comes from medieval thinkers. Final causality is the cause of causes. And so what I want to get at is this, and it's really, I think, a Peircean insight as well. We certainly can explain why things happen by referring to patterns, but the explanation of why there are patterns at all can't be explained by just another pattern that I point to. So just as we can talk about the relativity of parts and wholes, we can talk about the relativity of formal and final causes, right?
Mm.
So you know, what is merely an organization within some parts in one respect is also for the sake of an end outside of itself in another respect. So we can talk about the relativity of formal and final, but at the end of the day, when I try and explain why about anything, if I say that something acts the way that it is because it has this form, because it's a kind, I still can ask, why is there a kind at all? And the reason why things conglomerate and hang together such that there are regularities and stabilities. Stability, by the way, is a kind of rest. Something has come to rest. So the parts have hung together peaceably enough to be stable and at rest. And so the explanation of that stability can't be just by pointing to another stability. It has to be explained with respect to how the parts have already in them a kind of tending towards forming habits. So another way of saying it is, at the bottom, hidden beneath any kind of classical laws which presume regularities, is statistical mechanics that explains how those regularities become regularities to begin with. So there's a coincidence of form and formal and final, but explanatorily in the big picture, I think final wins out for the reasons given by the medievals. I could be wrong, but that's my instinct.
Could I jump in and add on
I
behalf
was going to ask.
Yeah, go ahead, George.
No, I was going to ask you to jump in if you would.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks. No, but on behalf of Michael, the other part of Michael's answer, which addresses May's question, which Michael didn't say, so I'm putting it to speak for you. I'll put on my, I could do that, right? Do a deep fake here.
Yes.
Is that it looked to Aristotle as if there was this coincidence because he didn't have the evolutionary record, and so he couldn't see all the failures. Right? In other words, Michael pointed to the fact that, well, there are all these failures where there wasn't a sufficient coincidence. And it's the ones that survive and hang around and stabilize in which we do find that coincidence. And so therefore it's in that set. It's that set that you just now were describing, Michael, and not the failures. But it's because of the failures that Aristotle could observe what he thought was a coincidence, at least in the biological cases.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think there's an inkling of that in Aristotle's posterior analytics when he talks about the rout and battle, where you stop the rout and you finally come together and stabilize. And interestingly, there's something like survivorship bias, because all those attempts at stopping the rout that never succeeded,
Right.
we don't know about them. It's the same reason why the victors write history, not all of the peoples that didn't succeed.
That's a good place to transition to one of the former combatants, Philip.
I was just going to say another military moment.
Yes, right.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Just the relation of order to final cause. But one thing first, you mentioned, what is it? Final cause is a cause of causes, and you know what the form of forms is, right? For Aristotle.
I'm not sure what you're driving at.
Nous.
Good.
Nous. No, it's nous. Or
It's
the
nous.
medievals,
Oh, of course.
I might
Yes,
as well
right,
say it's
right.
God, but yeah, the form of forms is nous.
And the tool of tools is the hand. Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, I just was interested in your understanding of what would be the relation of order to final cause. That's all.
Let me pick up the idea of nous. What I want to argue is nous is the place where the ordering that's in nature doubles itself and therefore is for itself as an ordering. So it's blindly an ordering in nature, and it doubles itself when it shows forward as an ordering that nous apprehends. So I want to do a Spinoza, Hegel, Aristotle move on what nous is. And I guess I want to say that when I'm thinking order, to get directly to your question, I'm thinking of an ordering among parts. And I'll put it this way. A group is a group because it has a final cause, because there's some shared love among the parts that makes it a group, not the other way around, which would be first you have a group and then it decides to vote on having a final cause, because you don't care about what other voters have to say to begin with unless there's a final cause making them care about voting to begin with. So I'd want to say that a shared end or a shared goal, a shared love, is what makes a group a group. It's not that they acquire that love after that. They don't acquire that love as a result of being a group. They're a group in the first place because there's a shared goal or love.
Does that apply to a group like the Proud Boys?
So I would argue we get it wrong when we think about posited groups as the model for groups. So any kind of vote about a goal is already secondary to these parts care enough to have a vote to begin with.
Mhm.
So there's got to be a prior non-articulated, non-posited shared end before there can be a voted upon posited end.
Here's a question from one of our participants that has been relayed to me, so I'll read it, and it's a piece for each of the two of you. For Michael, what is the role of desire or potentiality that you're committed to in your account of the identity of being and goodness? So that seems to follow well from these comments just now. For Wes, the question is, to what extent is your account fallibilist? What a priori, it says, what is a priori? Please say more about any necessity to being, if there is any.
Could I ask you to say again the role of desire and what?
Potentiality.
Okay. I'm not sure I will be apprehending correctly the connectedness of desire and potentiality, whether they're meant to go together in some way or whether they're two different elements that belong to one question. But I tend to find it easiest to talk about formal and final causes if I think of it in terms of parts and wholes. Aristotle's Metaphysics articulates the soldiers are the parts, the army is the whole. And the idea would be they're not an army unless they have a shared goal. So it's the common end, the common desire, what's called in politics the common good, that explains why they're coherent as a unity to begin with. So a desire for in the parts for the sake of a shared end is what explains why the parts cohere together as a whole. And apart from a shared end, they're only potentially a whole. They're scattered parts. The other piece in this is that, and it's a Wittgensteinian point actually, you have something like a game of cards only because for the most part, players don't cheat, but they're committed to the shared end of having a game of cards.
Right.
You can have a few cheaters and still a game of cards. But once you have more cheaters than game players, you don't even have a game anymore. Naturalistically, we could say a body is capable of having some cells within it that are not healthy but cancerous. And so the divergence from the norm, the divergence from the shared goal of health in the body is possible even within a few parts. But if you don't have a critical mass of parts that are aiming for the sake of a shared end, you don't even have a unity anymore. And by the way, political unities that we know today are, cancerous bodies where it's only power that really keeps them together rather than a shared end. So I'm not sure if that's responsive to the question, but
yeah, if I could jump in, sorry, that was my question. I was wondering, Michael, if you could say more about how this applies at sort of lower physical levels. I mean, I'm unhappy with your account of human intentions and armies and that sort of thing, but how far down do you want to push it? You want to go as far as Whitehead does say, all the way down? Where do we stop? Do we get to some level of prime potentiality or primordial desire? Or could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think I want to go all the way down, and I'm not well enough versed in the language of physics and subatomic particles and so forth to make the case. But I would want to say this: that you get something like a political unity because there's a shared end. So you get posited laws only because people know that they have a shared goal and a shared problem. So you start regulating through posited laws. And so, there's certain salient features of any kind of aggregation of people where if they share enough common issues and problems, they will then aggregate and then unify. And I want to say something similar at the atomic and subatomic levels, that you have parts that are otherwise chaotically related and scattered. And I don't use chaos in any technical sense, but they're not parts of a whole. But each part in its own has its own attractions, right? So an electron likes to be in the vicinity of this rather than that other kind of particle. So it repels some particles and likes being in the vicinity of other particles. And as long as you have a sufficient critical mass of particles that are either non-repellent or attractive to one another, and they can find rest near other particles through attractions and repulsions, you now have an atom. Now you have a molecule. So I'd want to say that it's the loves and the hates, the attractions and the repulsions, that explains why you have the unity of a whole.
Let me jump to Tim Eastman, who has, and then back to another questioner on a different point, but Tim has something relevant to this.
So these types of constraints on possibility have a very close reflection in modern physics with respect to the principle of least action. And from the principle of least action, it's, so to speak, it's like a constraint on possibility. And from that, you can derive basically Newton's equation and Schrödinger equation and so forth. So it's pretty clearly implied that PLA is very fundamental, and it has these elements that you're speaking about. So as to whether you can go all the way down, I'm not sure, but pretty far.
I think when you keep going, you end up with something like prime matter, or what might be pure energy, which is convertible with mass, but it's not knowable to us directly as pure energy, perhaps. But I think something like raw pure energy that's not instantiatable would be something like what the medievals called prime matter.
If I could just jump in, I think Tim's exactly right. If you do quantum electrodynamics in the Feynman mode, path integral mode, that's PLA. That's principle of least action in its own quasi-Hamiltonian structure. So it goes very deep, and I try to work with that as well from my different angle. Yeah.
You talk about Feynman. Feynman's 1948 thesis was exactly on the PLA.
We have a comment from Matthew Childers on the Wittgensteinian analogy. Matt, you want to?
Well, I found it evocative and interesting. I appreciated that. I'm going to steal that for my future thoughts on the matter. Thank you.
Let me also mention that I'm stealing it, and the person I'm stealing it from is Herbert McCabe. So if you just look up that name, he was a Dominican at Oxford University at New Blackfriars, and he is very Wittgensteinian, very Thomistic, and he makes many of these points that you need a critical mass of parts aiming at a common end in order to have a whole. So you lose the game of cards if there's too many cheaters. You lose the body if there's not enough healthy cells. Language dissolves if you don't have a sufficient number of correct game players in the language game. So Herbert McCabe is the place to go.
If I could jump in on that too, Michael and George, and Matthew, I think that's right for a certain class of domains, but I'd be hesitant to take that all the way down. The way I do it is distinguish within this purportive dimension. One of the forms of qualification is that's the teleological, the basis of the teleological stuff. Distinguish between structural, functional, normative, and ideal teleology. And what you're describing, Michael, is a functional teleology where you need that critical mass of cases. So, you know, only one sperm in a million need to have success, but you have, I mean, depending on the organisms at issue, depending on the case at issue, it will vary, but it's probabilistic, and there has to be some sort of definition of success. But if you go down to the physical, like the path integral example that Tim and I were talking about, that has to work pretty much all the time. I mean, there are going to be narrow limits where there might be failures, you know, CP violation failures and this kind of thing, but it has to be essentially almost definitional. And I take a Leibnizian, I take and recommend to you all a more Leibnizian sort of approach, which sees laws of nature as norms. And, you know, but it's not going to be that critical mass and you have to wait. Rather, they're functioning in a different way. And I think we go astray if we take, to use the language I was just invoking, functional teleology as the model for all the types, the ideal, the ethical ideals, and what you find in the physics, and vice versa. I mean, here's where there's something to the stratification that Larry's working with and Descartes is working with, and you know, Moravich, many others. I'm wary of the levels metaphor. I prefer to speak more of domains or branchings in the complex contingencies of nature. But you know, that has some purchase there, I think. Different types of teleology for different types of domains. And yet they're related, and yet I claim they have a common principle. But that common principle shouldn't be identified with anything at any one of those levels, which is why, incidentally, George, you said something about, in your summary remarks about my shtick, which I very much appreciate. There was something, you said, oh, for West, there is an ontological priority among the levels. Metaphysics isn't another level. See, that would be the move, right? It's not, it can't be just another level. As soon as you make it another level, you lost it. So I don't mean you personally, but I mean, we right? We try to say, well, and then metaphysics is another level. Then we've lost it. Later, if there's time, Francis, I think I heard a question for me earlier on from Francis, but we can come back to that. Go ahead, whoever's next.
May, you had a
I just have a quick, follow-up question about the nature being the source of the norms. And here we are living in a world that is rife with environmental crisis. And nature has changed, right, tremendously. And I'm just wondering how we continue to derive the norms by looking toward such a nature. How do we know that we're getting the natural nature?
I think I can be pretty brief, and it's this. I tend to agree with Marx. There is no such thing as nature in itself anymore because our technology has so drastically transformed nature. Marx says, except in a few uninhabited atolls somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, even our thinking and linguistifying symbolically what we call nature is a form of technology, as we learned from people like McLuhan and a lot of other theorists of technology and media studies. But I would say this, that the norms that are at work in nature that matter and give us guidance are not so much the norms that we, through our structures of representation and language, discover. Those come too late in the game. It's the norms within which we are already swimming. So Vinny, in an earlier session, mentioned that we would not have evolved if nature were not hospitable to us. So it's not so much going out and looking to discover norms that are there to be discovered, because the discovery is always within some representational technology. It's rather norms that are to be found more aesthetically by recognizing my embeddedness and indebtedness, and trying to then articulate through language and technologies what those are. But it takes a kind of listening and a kind of aesthetic sense, I think. That's what my quick response would be.
I'd agree with that, although I would add there's a little more. I would hope to find a little more for metaphysics here. This is exactly what I tried to talk about in my last MSA presentation a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
I mean, the way I come at ethics, is through, not surprisingly, you pick it up on the lingo, the qualifications of practice, and ethics is about the practice of those qualifications, and it's action about action and so forth reflexively, and to try to understand what natural agency would be like. But within that context, I think what Michael's saying is correct, except that we need to make sure that there's room in that embeddedness and appreciation for critique, which of course I know you'd go for, and so on. I'm not ready to give up on the language of nature, as you can tell from today, and also from that ethics oriented talk. I think it's, though a problematic notion to be sure. Just look at the 14 senses, right, that I'm dealing with in the 7 contrast, right? But it's useful, politically useful language. It's a term that we can rally around and use as leverage politically, despite its problematicity. And it's also not quite metaphysically dead yet either, for reasons I would say today. But in general, I'll close with this. You already know the answer, May, because you, on the one hand, there are the norms that we have in our culture. That's more the Aristotelian Hegelian part. They're on the move, but we're there. That's Michael's embeddedness. But there's also something which the Tao shows us. There's a way of nature that as we change, still remains a North Star for a practice. And to understand that in general is going to be a general sense of harmony and balance and so forth within oneself and with the environment. So it's going to seem very generic, and yet the specificity is always going to be given by the relationship between the current and the critique as you go.
Well, we're pretty much out of time, and I confess to Wes's earlier remark that I long ago have lost it. And my parts in my whole are been sloughing off for years, coming apart. So we're out of time and probably should wrap up. But thank you both. I know the rest of you will join me in thanking Michael and Wes for really great presentations.
Thank
and
you.
all of you for being here, and for Sienna Abla for helping us with the technical details this afternoon. Thanks, Sienna.